My name is Claire Aldridge. I'm 37 years old. And the sentence that ended my marriage was delivered with a grin. Not a confession, not an apology, a grin. I was lying in a hospital bed, 7 days post-surgery, still on the kind of painkillers that make fluorescent ceiling lights feel meaningful, when my husband Marcus sat down in the visitor chair, laced his fingers together like a man who has just closed a very good deal, and told me he'd taken care of everything. I said, "What do you mean, taken care of everything?" He said, "The business loan, the expansion. I handled it while you were out. You'll thank me later, Claire." He actually grinned when he said it. The way men grin when they've done something they've already decided you'll forgive. I didn't ask what loan. I didn't ask what expansion. I was still on a morphine drip and my incision hurt when I breathed, and I looked at my husband's grin and felt something cold move through me that had nothing to do with the IV. I asked him one question. "Whose name is on it?" And he said, "Well, yours, because your credit's better." "But I signed it. It's fine. You were sedated." I want you to hear that sentence one more time, because I need you to understand what kind of man smiles when he says it. You were sedated. Where financial betrayal gets the forensic attention it deserves, and the women who find the receipts finally get to read them out loud. If you've ever had someone make a major financial decision over your unconscious body and called it love, stay with me. This one's for you. Let me back up to before the hospital, because the hospital didn't create Marcus. It just gave him an opening. I'm a licensed contractor. I run a residential renovation business I built from a borrowed truck and a spreadsheet I kept on my phone because I couldn't afford software yet. By the time I married Marcus Aldridge, I had 8 employees, a solid reputation in 3 counties, and a credit score I treated like a 4th child. It had taken 11 years to build. 11 years of paying on time, keeping utilization low, never co-signing anything I didn't fully understand. My credit score was 814. I want you to remember that number. Marcus was a residential real estate agent, charming in the way that moves listings. He had a smile that made people feel like the only person in the room, which is a skill I now understand functions identically whether the room contains a buyer or a wife. We met at a property I was bidding on. He represented the seller. I won the bid. I thought I'd won something else too. We dated 2 years, married in year 3. And from the beginning, there was a pattern I noted and then filed under love, the way you file things you don't want to audit. Marcus had opinions about money that sounded like vision. He was always almost there. The big listing, the commercial deal, the developer connection that was going to change everything. He talked about money the way some people talk about weather. Constant, ambient, never quite arriving. And I, the woman with the spreadsheet and the 814, was the stable one. The foundation. The one whose numbers were real. He said this admiringly. For years I received it that way. The business expansion had been his idea for 8 months before the hospital. He wanted us to go commercial. Bigger contracts, office buildings, property management companies. He'd been talking to developers. He had contacts, he had a vision. What he didn't have was capital. I'd told him no 3 times, calmly with a spreadsheet. The residential market was strong. My margins were clean. Taking on commercial meant equipment, staff, insurance adjustments, a line of credit I wasn't ready to service. Not yet. The numbers said not yet, and the numbers are not a suggestion in my line of work. They are the structure the whole thing stands on. He heard not yet, as eventually, I should have heard that sooner. The surgery was a hysterectomy. Planned, necessary, not an emergency. Fibroids that had been making a scheduling request for 2 years and finally got their meeting. I had arranged everything. My site supervisor Danielle had the job schedules. My bookkeeper had the vendor contacts. I had a binder. Contractors make binders. Marcus drove me to the hospital. He held my hand in pre-op. He kissed my forehead before they wheeled me back and said, "I've got everything handled. Don't worry about anything." I remember thinking he meant the dog. The mail. The things that need handling when you're going to be horizontal for 10 days. He meant the loan. I was under general anesthesia for 4 hours. I came out of recovery at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday. Marcus was there when I woke up, attentive, present, refilling my water cup. He stayed 3 hours. He came back every day that week. On day 7, he told me about the loan, $48,000. A small business expansion loan through an online lender. the kind that processes in 48 hours and asks fewer questions than a bank. Applied for in my name, using my business information, my tax ID, my credit history. Signed, where the borrower signs, with my name, in his handwriting, while I was sedated. The loan had funded 4 days earlier. The money was already in a business account I didn't know existed, opened in my business's name, with Marcus listed as an authorized signatory. He had been busy while I recovered, and he was sitting in the visitor chair, still grinning, explaining that this was actually great news. The developer connection had come through. The timing was perfect. He'd taken care of it so I wouldn't have to stress during recovery. We were going to scale, Claire. This was the move. I'd thank him later. I looked at my husband. The morphine was wearing off and the incision pulled when I breathed, and the fluorescent light above his head hummed at exactly the frequency of something I should have heard years ago. I said 2 words: get out. Now I want to be honest about what I did next, because the next part matters more than the grin. I did not call the police from the hospital bed. I did not call a lawyer. I did not text anyone. Not my mother, not Danielle, not my best friend Kira, who would have driven there in 16 minutes. I lay in that bed for 2 hours with the TV off, and I did what I do when a job site goes wrong. I assessed the structure before I touched anything. The morphine was still in my system. Decisions made on morphine are not decisions. They are suggestions made by a person who isn't fully present yet. And I had learned a long time ago that the most expensive thing a contractor can do is touch a damaged wall before you understand why it failed. So I waited. My night nurse that week was a woman named Paulette. She was 58, Haitian American, and she had the specific energy of a woman who has seen every kind of human behavior in a recovery ward and made her peace with all of it. She took my vitals at 9 p.m. and looked at my face and said, "Your pressure's up. You want to talk about it, or you want to be left alone?" I said, "I need paper and a pen." She brought me a yellow legal pad and a ballpoint from the nurse's station. Didn't ask why. Some women just know. I wrote down everything Marcus had said in order. Loan amount, lender, account. His exact words. The date he'd said the money funded. His name on the authorized signatory line. My name on the borrower line. His handwriting. Then I wrote one more line at the bottom. He signed my name. I was unconscious. This has a legal term. I underlined it twice. Then I put the pad on the bedside table and looked at the ceiling and let myself feel it for exactly 1 hour. Not the loan, not the legal term, the grin. The fact that my husband had sat in that chair and grinned, that he had looked at his sedated wife and seen an opportunity and taken it and then come back to that chair every day that week and waited until she was lucid enough to be told and then delivered the news the way you deliver good news, like a man presenting a gift. That was the hour I needed. Then I picked up the pen and started writing questions. Here is the thing about a forged signature on a financial document. It does not live alone. Documents like that have trails. Applications have IP addresses. Uploaded files have metadata. Lenders have records of what they received and when, and in what format. And a business with an 11-year paper trail has a very clear picture of what its owner's actual signature looks like on the 237 documents she has signed in that time. I know this because my attorney told me. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I called Renata Osei 3 days after discharge. She's a family law attorney with a side fluency in financial fraud that I found through Kira, who had found her through a divorce support group Kira had never told me she attended, which is a whole other conversation. Renata answered her phone like the file was already open. I talked for 9 minutes. She was quiet for 30 seconds. Then she said, "Claire, before we talk about the marriage, I need you to understand what you're describing. A forged signature on a loan document in your name, using your business identity, without your knowledge or consent, executed while you were medically incapacitated, is not a marital dispute. It is a federal offense. Identity fraud. Potentially wire fraud given the online application. The marriage question is a question for family court. This question is a question for a different room entirely." She paused. "But they share a timeline. So we start at the beginning and we build both." I asked her how fast we needed to move. She said, "You have an open loan in your name funding an account you didn't open. How fast do you want to move?" I said, "Tell me what to do first." What I did first was nothing that felt like enough. That's the part no one tells you about when you imagine confronting betrayal. You imagine fire. You imagine the scene. What actually happens is paperwork. I requested the full loan file from the lender. I was the borrower of record. It was legally mine to request. It arrived in a portal, and I sat at my kitchen table, still sore from surgery, and read my own loan application with my husband's fingerprints all over it. The uploaded documents included a photo of my driver's license, taken from the copy he kept in his car for joint purposes we'd decided on years ago, my business tax returns, which lived in a shared folder on our home computer, a voided check from the business account, and a signature page bearing my name in handwriting that was close. Marcus had clearly practiced, but not close enough to fool someone who has signed her own name on 237 documents in 11 years. The lender's IP logs showed the application completed at 11:47 a.m. on the day of my surgery. I had gone under at 10:15, so while I was on an operating table, my husband was at home uploading my tax returns. I sat with that for a long time. Then I called Renata and told her what I'd found. She asked me to forward everything to a secure link she sent. Then, she said the sentence that rearranged something in my chest. You didn't just find evidence, Claire. You found a timeline. And a timeline is the most honest thing that exists. It cannot be charmed. It cannot be renegotiated. It will say the same thing in front of a judge that it said to you at your kitchen table. The confrontation came 11 days after discharge because Renata said nothing until we had everything, and everything took 11 days. I want to tell you what Marcus was doing during those 11 days because it matters to the shape of who he was. He was planning. He had hired a contractor to look at a commercial property. He had forwarded me 2 listings for warehouse space I hadn't asked about. He had talked to Danielle, my site supervisor, about the possibilities of scaling, the conversation I hadn't authorized, my employee, discussing my company's future with my husband while I was still taking the surgical pain medication. He had told his brother the business was expanding. He had already spent $11,000 from the account he'd opened. And every evening he sat across from me at dinner and asked how I was feeling and told me I looked better and said things like, "Once you're fully recovered, we'll go over all the plans together." His patience was infinite. He was a man waiting for his investment to arrive. 11 days post-discharge, I sat down at the kitchen table with the folder Renata had helped me build, and I said, "Marcus, I need to talk to you about the loan." He smiled. He actually settled back in his chair and smiled, the way you smile when the conversation you've been waiting for finally starts. He said, "I knew you'd come around." "Let me get my notes." I said, "I don't need your notes. I need you to look at something." I put the IP log on the table, the application timestamp, the copies of my documents uploaded from our home computer, the signature page. He looked at it. The smile held for longer than it should have. That was the tell. A man looking at something genuinely confusing does not hold a smile. He held it like a man deciding how to play the next card. Then he said, "I did what I had to do. You would have said no." That sentence. I need you to sit with that sentence. He did not say, "I thought you'd approve." He did not say, "I believed it was good for us." He said, "You would have said no." He had known. The entire time he had known that my answer was no, and he had decided that his vision for my company, purchased with my credit, signed with my name, while I was on an operating table, was more important than my no. I picked up my folder. I had one thing left to say. "Marcus," I said, "you signed my name on a federal loan document while I was under general anesthesia. That is not a business decision. That is not marital boldness. That is fraud. My attorney has the complete file. The lender has been notified. I'll be at Kira's tonight." He said, "You're being dramatic. This is a communication issue." I picked up my bag. I said, "Write that down. You'll want to remember how you described it." And I walked out of my own kitchen. I want to tell you about the next 6 months without the drama, because the next 6 months were not dramatic. They were methodical. They were exactly as boring as justice almost always is, and exactly as necessary. Renata filed the divorce petition. She also connected me with a financial crimes attorney named David Park, who had a way of discussing fraud the way a surgeon discusses anatomy. Precise, without judgment, because judgment is not useful in an operating room or a courtroom. David contacted the lender. The lender, faced with documentation that their borrower had been medically incapacitated at time of application, had a response that arrived with impressive speed. Loans that expose lenders to federal fraud liability move fast when the documentation is clean. The loan was voided. The $48,000 obligation was removed from my record. Marcus was required to return the funds from the account, which meant the $11,000 he'd spent became his problem to solve. My credit score, which had briefly and traumatically dipped when the loan appeared, was restored. It came back at 811. I lost 3 points and 11 months of my life. I consider this a reasonable accounting. The family court side was less tidy in the way that family court always is, because family court deals in people, and people are not clean instruments. Marcus hired an attorney who used words like oversight and miscommunication in documents that a judge eventually and somewhat wearily declined to find persuasive. The financial transfers during our marriage, some of which I had not yet found when I walked out of the kitchen, added up to $22,000 moved through our joint account into a personal account Marcus had maintained separately since the first year of our marriage. Since the first year. I want to let that land before I continue. The forensic accountant Renata brought in found it in 4 hours. 4 hours to find what had been moving through my life for 6 years because she knew where to look, and I had not thought to look at all. That was the part that sat with me longer than the grin. Longer than the forged signature. The 4 hours. If you've ever handed someone total access to your financial life because you called it trust, tell me in the comments. I want to know you're out there, because I spent a long time thinking that the blindness was my failure. It wasn't. It was the design. Marcus said things during the process. I'll give you the sequence because the sequence tells you everything. First, you're overreacting. This is fixable. Let's just talk. Then, you're destroying our marriage over a paperwork issue. Then, my attorney says the loan situation is more complicated than you think. Meaning, he had also spoken to an attorney before I walked out of the kitchen. The notes he'd offered to get were not business notes. Then, when the divorce filing landed, I did this for us. I did this because I believed in what we could build. I did this because you were always too cautious, and someone had to take the risk. Someone had to take the risk. With my name, my credit, my company's identity, my signature, practiced and placed on a document while I was sedated. Someone had to take the risk, and that someone was me, whether I agreed or not. The last thing he said, in writing, through attorneys, was that he hoped I would eventually understand his intentions had been good. I read that sentence twice. Good intentions are not a signature. They are not a legal defense. They are not a substitute for consent. And they are not. I want to be very clear about this. Something you get credit for when the person whose name you borrowed was unconscious when you borrowed it. I did not respond. The response was already in the court record. Here is the accounting, because you've stayed with me and you deserve the actual numbers. The loan, voided. 0 balance, 0 liability, record corrected. The $22,000 in marital transfers, ordered returned in the divorce decree, offset against marital assets. Marcus received less of the jointly held equity. He was surprised by this. He should not have been. Ledgers run in both directions. They always have. The commercial expansion did not happen. The developer connection evaporated when it became clear that Marcus's access to my business, my credit, and my company's financial identity was not a permanent condition. My business, still running. Same 8 employees, same 3 counties. Danielle is now my operations manager, because during those 11 months, she ran everything without being asked, and she deserves the title and the pay that should have gone with it years ago. My 814 became an 811. I have since, through the tedious, reliable magic of time and clean payments, watched it climb back. It is currently 819. 5 points higher than the day Marcus sat down in that chair and grinned. I find this satisfying in a way I don't need to explain. The kitchen I walked out of is now rented to a couple who are apparently very happy there. I bought a smaller house, 2 miles away, with a yard big enough for the garden I'd been postponing for 6 years. I have tomatoes. I have a contractor's eye for structural integrity, and I applied it to the house before I made an offer, and there was nothing hidden in the walls. That mattered to me more than I expected. There's something I want to say directly before I go, because I think it's the most useful thing in this entire story. Marcus was not a monster. I want to resist that framing because it is the easiest framing and it is the least honest. He was a man who had decided, somewhere along the way, that his vision was more important than my consent. That my caution was an obstacle rather than a structure. That the word no from someone he loved was a temporary condition he could route around. He didn't forge my signature because he was evil. He forged my signature because he had decided his belief in the plan was sufficient authorization. And that is, if anything, the more frightening version. Because monsters are rare. But men who decide their vision supersedes your signature, your consent, your sleeping body on an operating table. Those men sit across dinner tables every night in cities you know. They hold your hand in pre-op and kiss your forehead and wait. I'm not telling you to be afraid. I'm telling you to know where your name is. Know what it's signed to. Know what accounts it's attached to. Know what your credit history says and when it last changed. Know who has access to your documents, your tax returns, your business records, your license, not because everyone is Marcus, but because the only protection against your name being borrowed while you sleep is knowing exactly where you left it. I built a company with an 814 credit score and a yellow legal pad and a borrowed truck and 11 years of showing up. That is not a foundation anyone gets to borrow without asking, not even the person who kissed my forehead before they wheeled me back. If this story found you at the right moment, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you're the person in your family or your marriage or your business who does the quiet work, the careful work, the work that holds the structure up while someone else draws the plans, check the documents. All of them. Check them with your eyes open. I'll see you in the next one.